Hello, welcome to Jordan Sorcery's GW Books Club. This is the first ever episode of this brand new monthly video that's going to be on the channel every single month. And we're going to be taking the first 17 of GW Books' books and talking about them. I'm joined here by my good friend Stu from the Miniatures Realms channel. Stu, hello.
Hello. Hello. Nice to be here. It's a bit sweaty this evening in my office, so you can see me if I mopping my brow in the background. But and as usual, we've been chatting for ages beforehand, which tends
we have, but we've not exhausted all of the good conversation.
No.
That is still to come because we haven't even touched on the contents of our first book, which is Ignorant Armies. So this was the first book published by GW Books in 1989. It's an anthology of stories. That is what we're going to be talking about in this episode. We're going to go through each of those stories. We're going to talk a little bit about the story itself. We're going to talk about the context and a little bit about what we liked and what we didn't like and what we thought it was really about, if there was any hidden messages or if it gave us more information about the Warhammer world, or if we just enjoyed it, or even if we didn't as well, which, you know, we'll see if there's any of those in this particular collection. I did just want to give a quick call out to my exclusive Patreon book chat, which is something that I'm going to be doing every single month ahead of these videos. So all of my patrons get to join me in a live stream where we talk about the book at length. This one for Ignorant Armies ended up being 2.5 hours plus, and we went into real detail about every single one of these stories. We shared trivia, we shared thoughts and theories and all sorts of different stuff. It was really great fun. I had a fantastic time, and we're going to be doing that for every one of these books about a week before this particular video comes out. So if you want to be involved in that, then you can join my Patreon and you can join all of us in this new community of GW Books readers as we go through them step by step, all 17 of the original GW books. And if you want to just follow here on the channel, that is great as well. I will be bringing all of the cool stuff that we talk about in the Patreon exclusive chats into this conversation too. So Stu and I can mull it over and see what we think were the best comments and what was the coolest stuff. Great. Right. So Stu, what have you got a history with GW Books? Have you read all these books before? Have you read some of them? What's your sort of story here?
Well, I've read 2 now.
Right.
So prior to this, it was Route 666. I can't even remember buying it, but I remember owning it as a teen, and my teen era was pretty much everything your channel covers in terms of GW stuff. So the 3rd edition fantasy and the Road Trader and Dark Future and all the things that came out during that kind of late 90s or early 90s, mid 90s era before I went off to uni and pretended I wasn't a geek for a few years. So I had that book and I absolutely loved it. I think it was around the time I first watched Mad Max and things like that. So the game really grabbed me at the time, but I didn't read any of the other novels. Didn't read any at all. So I've been aware of them for years, and I've always been interested. Thinking, I might pick them up one day. But as the years have gone on and they've become out of print and harder and more expensive to get hold of, I've just not really thought about it. And then in more recent years, Black Library have put out some really excellent stuff, and I've been sort of devouring that really. So it's really interesting to go back and look at the kind of early origins of fiction from Games Workshop.
It's fascinating, isn't it? So I also had not read these, and similarly, they've always been there. I've always known they were around. They've dropped in and out of print, most of them. Some of them have never been reprinted. But I've kind of looked at them on the shelf and thought, oh, well, one day I'll get around to it. And then I never have until this year when I decided, okay, actually, I'm going to give it a go. And I read Drachenfels, which we'll be talking about next time, and I absolutely loved it. And then I made the history of GW Books, and I got to experience a little touch of each one of these books as I was researching them. And that is why I really wanted to start this book club, because it is some of the stories that are in here are super interesting. It's of such an interesting time in the development of Warhammer and the history of the game, and 40k as well, when it wasn't quite this cohesive thing. There's still so much stuff that's moving around, this melting pot of ideas, and we know obviously what those universes have gone on to become, but this is something there's a kind of primordial aspect to this. This is all super interesting, and anything goes in some of these stories, as we'll see when we get to them. So yeah, I this was the first time I'd read Ignorant Armies, and I'm very glad I did. I'll put it that way, and we can come back to sort of the final view as we get into it. So let's start then with the first one, the first story in this collection. It is Geheimnisnacht by William Bill King, and this is the first Gotrek and Felix story. So I will also just point out that I'm going to have to apologize. I'm sure there'll be very many comments about my pronunciation of Gotrek. It will change. It will go back and forth. I do my best, but when I first read it as a child, it just got imprinted in my brain as the wrong pronunciation. So I apologize to everyone about that. Felix, I can say that without problem. That's all right. But this story is the very first time we will get to see this famous troll slayer and his friend. This is the first story in all of the GW books history, and it is about two characters who will go on to exist for decades, and still, one of them at least, exists to this day, even despite the end of the Warhammer world. So an incredible first starting point. And this story is about Felix Jaeger, a former radical who has pledged his life to this troll slayer who saved him from during a riot. There was some cavalry that was going to crush him, and Gotrek grabs him and saves him. And together they are now just traveling the lands and almost doing good deeds in a way. And on this particular night, Geheimnisnacht, this creepy Halloween-esque night, they encounter a black coach on the road, which almost runs them down. They then follow up on this particular mysterious coach at this nearby inn, where they find out that a young son of the innkeeper has gone missing. Can they go and rescue the innkeeper's son up at the weird standing stones where rituals take place, and maybe there's something a bit shady happening? Gotrek is absolutely up for this. Felix is perhaps a little bit more reticent, but together they go into the night. They encounter all kinds of gribblies and cultists and what have you. They interrupt this particular ritual, save the day, save the child. And that's kind of this story, I think, right? That's fair to say. I mean, how did you feel about this first story in the collection, Stu?
It's one I've read many times. So it's the first story in Troll Slayer, which I've read recently to my son, who's 8 at the moment, so he's not 9 till November. You made a comment in the Patreon chat with someone else had read it to their 8-year-old child, I think a daughter. I don't know who it was, but you said, well, that was brave. And there's the odd line or two, I have to admit, that gets a little bit close to the mark with certain things. But most of it is just kind of real rip-roaring fantasy fare with heroes taking on a lot of mutants. Seems to be a prevailing thing. But I've got a very big place in my heart for Gotrek and Felix. I've read all of the original Bill King books. Absolutely love his writing. And I've read the Nathan Long books as well. I've not read the more modern versions, not because I'm angry at the change in the world as such, just because I haven't got around to it and I've moved on. But a really fond connection with these stories, and it's really nice to see that at essence their connection and the way they are together doesn't really change. You learn more about their history because you gave a little bit of a background to how they came together. And they both got a lot more in their background that you sort of learn and it develops throughout the novels, which I don't want to spoil here, I suppose. But it's a lovely start to the book, and a very strong start, I think, and very Warhammer, and still feels very Warhammer, even though the style has changed slightly. Still instantly recognizable as Warhammer, whether that's mostly down to the characters and they feel like Warhammer, I don't know, but it definitely feels very Warhammer, especially compared to a few other stories that are a little bit more out of the way we'll cover later.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really Warhammer-y, for want of a better word. And it's almost, you're right, I think, when you say it's this kind of rip-roaring adventure, and it's a great start to the collection. And it's a great start to GW books, I think, as well, because it really brings you in. It's super accessible because it is just these two adventurers, yeah, it's a bit of a creepy quest that are going on into the darkness of this forest, but it's also just very easily understandable. There is someone who is in trouble, and these two heroes are going to go and intervene and save the day. There are some complications in the sort of fabric of that story. The nature of the evil is obviously a bit more nuanced because we're talking about chaos and the weirdness of chaos, especially at this time when chaos was not quite the version of chaos that we would see today. I mean, I think one of the Patreons on the discussion, Anvil of Doom, said that there's a grayness to the effects of chaos during this era, and I think that's absolutely right. There's kind of not quite the same. It's definitely, this is, once you're corrupted by chaos, this is the full thing that's going to happen to you. There's like a weird kind of sliding scale of being corrupted and the chaotic effects and the cultists and all that sort of stuff. And we see some of that in this story. We'll see way more of that in later stories. But in this one, you get that first taste of chaos is weird, but it's also got some other stuff going on as well.
Almost like, should we feel sorry for people that have been tainted by chaos? It's almost treated a little bit more like being bitten by a zombie or being ill, like lepers or something almost. It's that kind of, rather than that sort of very straight line, well, they wanted to do it and then they're often on their path to skulls and blood or whatever it happens to be. It definitely feels a little bit more like the more educated characters maybe or question a little bit more. I feel a bit of guilt about chopping that mutant's head off because that would have been a person once, whereas some of the more simpler folk are portrayed more as a kind of a scared burn the witch kind of things. But it's very Middle Ages as well, and it's got a presentation of it. But
absolutely, yeah, and
it's funny as well.
Oh,
and that's how it offsets the what is quite often grimness of it. It's really fun. Their interactions between the characters is funny. Obviously, that develops a lot more through. So my mind is muddled with how many books I've read of them, and even recently. But I love the humor, and that's one of the things that my 8-year-old loves as well. So Felix has got quite a dry, sarcastic humor at times. Gotrik's just,
he's quite sassy.
And then Gotrek just doesn't care, and he's blunt, and and it's the Oldhammer podcast. I'm sure that'll be brought up a few times in our chat today. I loved his version of it, and his Brummy Gotrek really threw me at first because I'm so used to hearing him sounding like a Yorkshireman or something, and it was brilliant. It was made different changes, but it's the accent and the audio performance, if you listen to the audiobooks, is really builds out the humor as well. And I wind my son up if he can't do something, he can't open a bottle or something, I'll be like, you're weak, Malling. And it's kind of become a joke within our, sorry, terrible impression, but it's something we have humor with now, and that runs through this in a way that, again, something like some of the other stories might not later on. And it's, like you said, it's a really strong start to the book because of that, I think.
And because I've never read any Gotrek and Felix story, so this is literally the first one I've read. So I'm obviously being immersed in Warhammer and Warhammer lore for decades. I know who they are. I know their sort of broad characters and their various exploits. I've just never sat down and read those stories. So to see here how well constructed their relationship is, they have a really strong dynamic. They are really clear and well-defined characters as well. I almost didn't expect it to be quite as well written as that for a first story, especially for the first story of the whole franchise. You really do get the sense, there is this Gotrek character who has done something, we don't know what it is, but he's been exiled, and now he is on this quest for redemption. And it is a more grounded, certainly at this point. I mean, I believe it maybe gets less grounded and his tale becomes more extravagant, I guess. But in this one, it's a very grounded version of a Slayer, and everyone always loves Slayers, and everyone always does an impression of a Slayer when there's a dwarf army on the table. But this is a guy who has experienced some kind of tragedy or event in his life. He's done something wrong, or something wrong has happened, and now he just wants to find his death, and he's going to find it wherever it comes. And there's it isn't as one note as that could be. I think there's a bit more nuance to him. I felt more depth about him than just being a caricature.
Yeah, and that comes out more through I suppose in the first book, the first book overall, and through all the short stories are in it, you get more and more from both characters. You find out that Felix is oath sworn to him to basically document his doom and tell his story, and it's kind of both of their personalities grow in that sense, and it's very good. You should definitely, when you have time, you should definitely read it.
I've got a few books on the shelf to go.
You'll enjoy Skaven Slayer, I think.
I think I
will. Or maybe not. It's which way you're looking at it.
Yeah, I do find it hilarious that the titles, because obviously they fall into that rhythm of Slayer, something Slayer, whatever it might be, Troll Slayer, Skaven Slayer, and now they've ended up with Realm Slayer because now
they didn't know how many they're going to have to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's not just fighting a single Skaven, now he's fighting the universe, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I think it's lost a bit now.
But the other thing with Felix as well, is quite a defined character. Yeah, he has that sort of sardonic sass. He's kind of sly comments out of the corner of his mouth. He also feels quite well-rounded, because again, it could be quite one note in that he could just be a coward who is like, I have to be here, but I don't want to be, and I'm afraid. And he has that fear in the story, but he also is brave enough to overcome it, and he gets stuck in when the time is right. He sort of is competent as well. So I really liked them, and I enjoyed this story a lot. Yeah, it's very good.
Definitely.
I mean, you mentioned the manling thing. I was just going to say the first line, which is curse all manling coach drivers and all manling women. Muttered Coach Red Gurnison, adding a curse in Dwarvish. And yeah, it's an odd, fun line that it just totally establishes the nature of this dwarf in one line, I think.
It follows up afterwards as well. I've not got it open in front of me, but it essentially starts with a joke, doesn't it? The first line, the first paragraph is a gag.
Yeah,
because it's then Felix's reaction to Gotrek groaning and grumbling and moaning, and that pretty much sums up what all their stories are like in one sense or another, with a bit of stupid a bravery maybe in it and some heroism at times as well, but they're all very, very similar. They just work. They're just very simple, easy. It's almost a bit like a classic RPG story, isn't it? When you go off and you get your mission. So they've gone into the tavern, haven't they? You sets the scene. So that's the black coach going by. They go into the tavern and then they get given their quest. And then they go off to see their quest, but they mess it up in a bit, and they can't go back and collect their cash at the end, because they find out something that compromises their return to the tavern. Can't really bring his son back, and we found out the daughter that went missing the year before was there as well. And so yeah, I like that as well. Yeah, so it's kind of dry, dark humor. It's kind of I don't know. It's not too grim. So there's no dead babies at the end of it. The baby was saved, but the kind of all of that euphoria about the victory is taken away by the reality of it, I suppose. But it's still kind of slightly amusing. Well, we can't go back to the village kind of feel, rather than so.
Yeah, and I like that, and I think because the classic tale that Bill King tells is that he based this on his own Warhammer Fantasy roleplay adventures, and I think you're right. That through line definitely is there in terms of the adventure structure. But I quite like that, like a good game of Woofrub. Yeah, like you say, there is a darkness to the ending. It's normally sober. There's thing you may well have saved the day, but it's not pretty. It's not a nice neat bow tied on it. I mean, in this one there's a nice note of almost like quite happy, sweet ending, in that they save the baby, like you say, and then they drop that off at a temple of Shalaya and ride off in the black coach that they've stolen, which is quite a cool ending. But yeah, but
not everyone's happy. The people in the village,
there's a cost. Yeah,
they're going to find a mess.
Yeah,
someone's got to clear up what happened in the woods, and it's not. Yeah, it's going to take a lot of shovels and a lot of sadness, I imagine. But so there is that element to it that keeps it Warhammer.
Yeah, and quite grounded as well. It's not. There are consequences to these kinds of adventures. You don't just get to save the day and there's no and that's it. It's nice and neat and clean. As you mentioned, the Oldhammer Fiction podcast, which I agree, absolutely fantastic, really good versions of these stories. I will put some links in the description below so people can check those out as well if you've not been able to get hold of a copy of the book. As Lewis mentions at the end of his reading of this story, there's also a really nice sort of aspect to it that the people who find the consequences, the aftermath of it, can't distinguish. They don't see it as a hero turned up to save the day. They think that everything that Gotrek and Felix have done and all the devastation that they've left, where they've destroyed all these chaos cultists, they think that's part of the ritual because it looks so messy and bloody and, you know, and violent. And that's it. The nature, it's almost this whole thing of yeah, Gotrek is doing the right thing and saving the day, but his methods almost look like the same kind of chaos that he's stopping. And that's quite an interesting little Warhammer-y end point as well, to kind of question the heroes. Yeah, but it's a great story. I enjoyed it a lot.
Definitely. Well, it's gonna. That was always a strong start for me, and some of the other stories were always going to be up against it with my love of Gotrek and Felix. But we shall see as we go on.
Yeah. So the second story, The Reavers and the Dead by Charles Davidson. This is probably, it's not a simpler story, but it's a very different tone and feel, I think, to what we just had with Geheimnisnacht. So in this tale, a young man, Helmut Kurzer, who hates his life living in this fishing village and just having to live day to day there, has started to dabble in a little bit of necromancy, as some kids are wont to do, sneaking up into the graveyard, playing around and bringing animals back to life. But then Norse raiders arrive to assault the village and slaughter everybody who's there. Kurzer hides in the graveyard and he discovers this access route into some chambers of a long dead lich who basically offers him a deal. Become my apprentice, give me some of your life almost, and I'll give you some of my power, and then you can go and get revenge on these Norse raiders. And then he does this, he takes up the deal, brings back to life all of the villagers, including his own family who have been killed, and wipes out the Norse raiders, and then goes back into this little chambers to presumably live a long and happy life as a brand new lich. So what was your how did you feel about this story as the follow-up, as the next story in the book?
I quite enjoyed it. There was some of it was very predictable. You could almost guess what was going to happen from the first moments he goes into the burial chamber. But there were some other elements that were quite stood out as different. The conversation between Helmut's parents about him always being a bit of a useless child, and the father's clearly not very proud of him and almost blames it on the mother, sort of thing, isn't it? They've almost disowned him and don't want him, which is quite dark, really.
Yeah.
They were wishing they could have another child because the first one's a bit of a dud. And I can imagine a lot of teenagers reading that and feeling they are they're an introverted child, which many of us gamers maybe were or still inverted at the time. And it feels like kind of there's a little bit of a connection with the kind of the bullied child, the friendless person, the different person, the misunderstood. And so you've got that kind of build up to it, but unlike an 80s American film, he doesn't come good and get the girl at the prom at the end. He ends up raising the dead. So it's different in that sense. So it feels like there's a kind of a mini serious bit when they added some depth to the characters, rather than it just being this. They could have started with young necromancer or lich or something, couldn't they? But I like the way they kind of built that and added a little bit of depth into the story. I say they, Charles Davidson. But other than that, the story was fairly straightforward. I feel there was I suppose it was implied that his activities had somehow killed off the fish in the seas to the north, and that's why the raiders were there. So him dabbling with necromancy has caused this raid in the first place. So again, maybe he was a useless child who shouldn't have been messing around with things. Honest, me feeling, I don't know, I felt a little bit sorry for him, not just because of his outcome at the end, but also because he felt like he's obviously not a natural fisherman, and he wasn't in the place he should be in his life, and because of that, idle hands and all the and all the rest. And look what happened. But I liked it. It seemed pretty straightforward. It could be in any setting, not necessarily Warhammerish, but again, that's also Warhammer's a pretty standard fantasy world in many ways, especially in this era. It wasn't as well defined as it is now in many ways, and especially with how Warhammer's changed. That's why we have all the changes with AOS to really cement that IP. At this period, when I grew up playing it, it felt very much like one of the many fantasy worlds.
Yeah.
And the big difference, the big standout change was probably chaos and the way that was handled, and that's grown more over the years. But in terms of dealing with necromancers, liches, and Norse raiders, it could be anywhere, couldn't it?
Yeah, and so there's a few points I really agree with. I think there's a great shout there about almost the kitchen sink drama aspect of it, where you do spend some time with his parents and you do get a perspective. Because like you say, you didn't necessarily... There are versions of this story that wouldn't have that would have just been, okay, he's up there doing his necromancy, the Norse arrive and they take out the village. And we find out his parents are dead, and the sadness is just the very fact that they're his parents, I guess. But because we do get to spend a little bit of time with them, it does turn them into more rounded characters, and you do get to find out a little bit of the family drama, why he has ended up doing what he's doing potentially, and what's sort of driven in that direction. But then also that they were sort of maybe doing their best and they just didn't understand him. And like you say, I think that's a really good shout about it being relevant to the audience likely to be reading it at the time. That sort of, maybe there were some disaffected teens, and that does come up again and again, actually, the teenage protagonist throughout these stories, presumably because that is who they were trying to sell the books to. But yeah, I think there's definitely something there. And you maybe do feel a little bit sorry for him, but there is his decisions aren't great, and the consequences are pretty significant as a result, right?
Yes, yeah. There's been introverted, and then there's atrocities related to it, isn't there? There are different levels. There's no excuse for his dabbling. He was still doing something evil within the world of Warhammer, and something he knew was wrong. Clearly knew was wrong.
And I like that twist though, of because you get the sense, at least I did when I first read it, that the Norse raiders, it felt like they were just random raiders, and this was a fishing village that just got randomly targeted. But then at some point you do discover that there is a reason, and it is tied to that whatever's happened to the fish, and whether that is the necromantic powers that have caused it. So he's caused this event to take place, as opposed to the Norse guys being just straight up bad guys. And they are still bad guys because they do still slaughter an entire defenseless village, but they were at least doing it because they thought there was something evil there. And then
that almost makes it less Warhammer and more history.
Well, I think the way they go about it though is pretty they're pretty full on. They don't come and ask questions, and they're like, guys, can we work together to solve this problem? They're straight in with the axes.
I don't think they asked many questions at Lindisfarne in when the Vikings. So, but that's the point I'm making there is that I think that by adding the reason for it, and that maybe they were starving, their perceived reason for it within their limited world view, they thought that they were doing the right thing. So of course it's not a good thing. But where does the evil really exist within that kind of world? And as I say, it seems to have, you remove the necromancy from that, and you could tell a story from you're not supposed to say Dark Ages anymore. I think historians don't use that term, but if I say Dark Ages, more people probably know what I'm talking about. But it's like a Viking raid, isn't it? It's raiding an Anglo-Saxon village is something that could quite easily be believable.
But then actually you've got maybe that this ties it more closely to Geheimnisnacht, where you've got, like, because again, Gotrek is doing what he thinks is the right thing, and he's using his violent methods to achieve it. That's what these guys are doing. The only person so far who's, well, I suppose the Chaos cultists in the first story. In this case, Helmut Kurzer, the boy who's getting involved with the necromancy and the lich thing. But then, as we'll see actually later on, necromancy is not quite as bad as all that, it seems. in this version of the Warhammer world. And I know there's a lot of stuff in the lore around the Wizards' War and the expunging all of the, eradicating all the necromancers and the wizards and all that sort of stuff from the Empire. But there's a few stories here where people aren't as down on necromancy as you might expect, I think. So
yes,
there's a certain, the guy next door might be a necromancer. He's a bit weird. He might be a necromancer, but he's just keep leaving to himself. Sort of.
He only uses him as a cleaner. It's fine, isn't it?
But yeah, I mean, the Lich though, who is doing this deal with Helmet, is a bad guy, it seems, and there's definitely is going to be taking advantage. And the end of the story is very much a sort of note of, okay, actually, Helmut Kurza might have gotten in deeper than he thought.
Yes.
And is he either going to be possessed or killed in some way, or basically is his life over? And I think that ties back to the first line, because the very first line of the story is that he basically has realized he's going to die as soon as he sees the ships on the horizon. And the assumption from the reader, I think, is that, the ships are going to be what gets him. But it's not. It's this hidden evil that's going to get him, in fact.
And did he realize at that point which it would be?
I don't think he did. No, I think he thinks it's the ship. And maybe he thinks that actually he's going to get away with it now because he's got the power of this Lich. But then actually, no, he isn't going to get away with it because he's started the ball rolling on his own death.
And do you think the Lich was the reason, the proximity of the Lich? Do you think the Lich was already working as a character that they knew was weak and susceptible? Or is it just a big coincidence that he was dabbling with necromancy, with raising squirrels or whatever he was doing?
Sure.
And then he happened to know about this tomb that he could go to, and because he seemed like he knew what he was doing, but was he being led there? I haven't got it in front of me. There's a scene when he was being spoken to. It was almost like he was mentioned being in a dream or something, in a dream state, and he didn't really have any control over the conversation, and it makes you wonder whether the Lich was already exerting some control over him before it happened.
It'd have to be, right? I mean, that's the classic version of this sort of tale, is that you're drawn to it because of the power emanating, whether or not it's as directly as someone giving you visions or a voice in your head, or it's just a sense that I should go up to the graveyard and hang out because it feels right. Like that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought, but maybe the Lich is being more actively corrupting him for a longer period of time, potentially. I mean, that's classic Warhammer, in fact, isn't it? Of just like corruption slowly like working its way through people's souls and the world itself is just slowly being corrupted over time.
It's all about the corruption of the weak and the greedy, isn't it? There's very little else than that in terms of people's motivations. They're either outright evil to start with, or they're weak, or they're greedy, and it kind of falls into one of those brackets.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of consequences to actions, and the consequences are quite quick and quite brutal, oftentimes. Yeah, although there's some stories where it's not always quite as instantaneous as you might think. I think it's interesting. So this was written by Charles Davidson, but that's the pseudonym of Charles Stross. And there's quite a few authors in this collection, and in all of GW books, in fact, who use pseudonyms.
Aren't they all pseudonyms in this, apart from Bill King?
Not all of them. I think Nicola Griffith and Bill King, and Steve Baxter is Stephen Baxter, so he's not that far away from it.
That's not.
But yeah, there is a fair few pseudonyms. But Charles Stross has actually written, I mean, he's written loads and loads of other stuff, but one of the things he wrote was Atrocity Archives, which is almost like Delta Green, if you're familiar with that. It kind of takes a bit of Lovecraftian lore and then puts it alongside like the Secret Service and British intelligence and that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And they made an RPG of it called the Laundry, because the Laundry Files was the name of the series. But I think that's interesting that the author's got this Lovecraftian form. He goes on to write a lot of stuff that's kind of drawing on Lovecraftian kind of ideas, because there's a bit of that here as well, of the sort of the curious mind and inquiring into certain stuff. And as soon as you open that door, you have damned yourself. You read that book or you speak those words, you have basically signed up to unknowable horror taking over yourself. So yeah, there's certainly something there. It's interesting, I think. Fantastic. What one? I mean, I think you were right as well when you said that it's not necessarily that Warhammery on the face of it. I mean, in fact, Jim Ball in the Patreon discussion said that it's not as instantly Warhammer in a recognizable way, and I think that's fair to say, because it does take place in a relatively generic corner of the Warhammer world, and you don't necessarily learn a lot about the Warhammer world from it, because all this, like you say as well, it could be a historical setting for the most part, if not for the magical stuff. And I wonder if the themes maybe get it closer to being a more Warhammery story, and that the corruption and stuff. But if it's not quite there,
I think it works because you don't always have to have the really sort of headlining Warhammer stuff. That doesn't mean it doesn't make it not a Warhammer story as such, but because those things are missing. I think it's an era thing. I think it's because we're in the modern era when we think Warhammer, we're thinking of races and things beyond chaos all the time, and because chaos is a lot more subtle and grey here, and even the necromancy is common in all fantasy, because you haven't got greenskins talking about da boys and stuff like that in these stories. You of course you could take these stories and place it in another area. If you don't have any place names that are recognizable, any characters that are already recognizable, Gottfried and Felix obviously already were, so your mind automatically goes there. I wonder if you change the names of those characters, whether, and you hadn't read Gottfried and Felix, whether you feel the same about that as well. I don't know how we're conditioned.
That's a really good point, actually. Yeah, because if this wasn't Helmut Kurzer, this was like Heinrich Kemmler.
Yes,
or the Lich,
a young Heinrich Kemmler
or if the Lich was Nagash or the Dread King, or it was someone more recognizable.
Yes,
I think that's a fair point, actually. Yeah, maybe I want the cameos left, right, and center. I want all of that sort of stuff. But no, I think that you're right. That is maybe me taking a more modern perspective of having read so much lore and other stories set in the Warhammer world for 40 odd years. Now there is a very clear definition and a real rich fabric to that. At the time, well, this is just a random story about a random necromantic kid.
I was just going to say, I played fantasy roleplay in this era, and that would have been Warhammer, because back then that's what Warhammer would have been recognizable as to me. So I think it's that kind of, you identify with more the IP over time, that you kind of changes your perspective on it. So it's not Warhammer, but it's not instantly recognizable. So you almost need to be told it's a Warhammer story.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think it's a good follow-up to Geheimnis Nacht, because it's different, and as you said at the top, it is more straightforward in a way, but it's telling a completely different story. It's giving you a different place, a different feel.
There's no gags. It's kind of dull and dark and depressing.
I mean, did you enjoy it overall, this one?
I did. Yes. Yeah. I think I think it was good as a short story. I didn't go on thinking, I wish there was more. I think it worked as a relatively short story as well.
Yeah.
And it was just a nice little snippet tale that give you a picture, a snapshot of different areas within this Warhammer world as it was at the time. So I did enjoy it. Yeah, it wasn't something I'd think, oh God, that was a bit weird. It didn't take me out of the Warhammer aesthetic, which I was put into with the first story. I still feel like, we're here. We're in late 80s, early 90s Warhammer still.
Yeah,
I did feel like it.
Yeah, no, me too. I enjoyed it as well. And it's right when you say it's one of the shorter stories in the book. I think this and Apprentice Luck are actually the two equally shortest at just 19 pages. So they are much more succinct in their storytelling, and they probably are the two that are the most straightforward. And we'll get into Apprentice Luck in a little bit. But yeah, I think it was fun. I thought it was a good story that told a different it gave us a different window into just what might be happening one random night in the Warhammer world. Yeah. Okay, let's move on then to another story. This is The Other by Nicola Griffith. This is one that, when I was discussing it, there's a load of people really enjoyed this one. And I think this is quite a popular story because there's quite a lot of depth to it, I think. So this is the story of a young apprentice doctor called Stefan, who meets a mysterious stranger called Katya, who they are on their way. He's on the way with his father into Middenheim. There is an upturned cart. There's been an accident. Someone is injured. He and his father, they're both doctors. They go to try and step in and help. And this mysterious woman, Katya, is already tending to the injured. It turns out she doesn't have a license. So she sort of goes on her way. There's a bit of a vibe of, the nature of the constrictive world of Middenheim and the Empire, and you have to have a license to be a doctor, and actually being a doctor just means you can charge people for medical care, and if you don't have any money, you're just going to get sent to the temple, and maybe you'll get some help, and she's kind of upsetting that order a little bit. But then once Stefan, the younger doctor, gets his license, he goes out to celebrate. He goes to an inn called the Red Moon, where he sees Katya again, and this time she's singing, and she tells a tale in her song of someone who encounters a small stone that they think it might be something else, but actually turns out to be warp stone, and it gets heated over the fire and explodes and embeds in her arm, and that bit of warp stone then corrupts her arm and mutates it, and then she gets possessed by chaos and ends up burning down the house with her in it. From that, Stefan becomes kind of a little bit obsessed with Katya and sort of stalks her a little bit, follows her around, discovers that she's helping the poor people of Middenheim with their medical care, who may or may not themselves be mutants. There's kind of a bit of a question mark over that. And Stefan is in a weird place about this. He's not comfortable with it. But then he gets super jealous because he finds out that Katya is spending some time with the Deputy High Wizard, Jana Eberhauer, and he thinks there's something romantic maybe going on there. It actually turns out that the story that Katya told in her song was true, and it was her who was affected, and it was her leg, not her arm, and she's been covering it up. And the Deputy High Wizard, with Stefan's help, can cure her from this chaotic mutation and this sort of effect that's starting to take her over. And there's kind of a question mark over whether he's going to do it or not. He does. He becomes a better person as a result of the events of the story, and he kind of sends her on her way to go and help the poor people. And he himself says, you know what, I'm going to go, and instead of being a doctor who charges people, I'm going to go and work at the temple and be a better person. So there's a lot in this story. I've probably not done it justice in that summary because it's much more. There's a richness and a depth, I think, to the story as well. But how did you feel about this one?
I really enjoyed it. It's very different. And it was all the way through, I didn't know what was going to happen or what to expect, which is obviously a mark of a good story. You can kind of guess with a Gottfried and Felix kind of story, and it was very easy early on. As soon as you worked out this young necromancer was a necromancer, you knew what was going to happen there. Whereas this, honestly, didn't know. You expected there was going to be the almost telegraphed twist that she was going to be a mutant, but there was enough doubt in his mind that maybe it was all about him, and there was definitely a lot of about his insecurities as a young surgeon, the way he felt about himself, and sort of reflecting on the way that she treated him. She made him almost seem boyish and churlish. He was obviously a wealthy man throwing his money around at the bar, and she was poor, but he was attracted to her. So there's lots of complications there. So there was always a chance that there could be a twist here, and it's not that. It's not her at all. It's someone else. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. It's one I would have, been happy for it to be longer. I felt like it ended fairly abruptly, but again, that's the nature of a short story, I suppose. I think it was quite interesting that the wizard played such a background part in it. Really, it was very much about his thoughts as a surgeon. But I'm surprised the surgeon could do much, really, and maybe that's the way Warhammer's changed. That removing a bit of warp stone, you'd have guessed that, well, that's not going to do anything, but it seems to suggest that it maybe did work. I don't know.
I think but I quite liked that there was this weird interaction where, in order to save Katya and stop this mutation from taking root, it was you need someone to do the sort of surgical procedure at the same time as you need someone to do whatever the sorceress procedure is.
Yes.
I'm sure there's no real, like, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but there's also something quite fun to me about that conceptually, that it takes both the physical and the magical in order.
Yeah, it's not that it doesn't work, because it clearly does work, but you don't see many Warhammer stories go down that route, do you?
Yeah, not many at all.
I quite liked it. I like that there's no fighting or implication of fighting in it at all, really. It's not a story in that sense. It doesn't feel so much like something you might do on a role play evening. It might be a side quest. It's not a main. It's not something. It might be something. I don't know if I haven't role played for years, but occasionally myself, when I was younger, my best friend, it'd just be the two of us, and we'd run small adventures for each other, and they might be more like this because you're interacting with other characters, and it's more about the conversations and the problem solving, the puzzle solving, rather than the kind of the group get together and the fighting. So in that sense, it feels more like exploring that kind of avenue as a story rather than another way. But it's hard to kind of go too deep into it, because there's more questions, I think, about what the world would be like and what they did afterwards. For me, it's as soon as you know the secret, it takes away any further mystery in some ways, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I enjoyed it as well. I think it is a good one, because it does have, it feels more literary, if I don't know if that's the right term for what I mean here, but yeah, it feels more like an exploration of character, an exploration of certain themes, and kind of using the fact that you have this fantasy setting and this idea of chaos to explore some other stuff. And it's not this, maybe it's unfair to say, but the surface level stuff you might have seen in like the Reavers and the Dead, which I think there is more subtext in that than we probably got into, but not as much as there is here in this particular story. Because you kind of have, and there was a real good debate we had about who is the other, what is the other in this story? What does the title refer to? Is it the mutants? Is it the poor? Is it Stefan himself? Because maybe he can't, he has no compassion, he has no sympathy for anybody else. So he's sort of othered everyone, and that therefore has othered him. He doesn't even get on with his father, and like he doesn't want to be a doctor. He doesn't care about that relationship. He's kind of got a bit of a difficult, strained relationship with his father, the doctor, whether it's jealousy or what have you. So you kind of have this interesting question there. And then there's all other things within the text as well. So we get the sort of general sense that Stefan is jealous that maybe Katya and the Deputy High Wizard, who's a woman as well, that they might be having some kind of affair. And I mean, one thing that I really liked is that that's unremarked upon. That's just totally fine. That's not even an issue. And I think that's great. The issue for Stefan is that he's jealous because he wants to be having the relationship. So there's these kinds of things as well. There's other sort of aspects to it I think are really super interesting. I agree. Once you then know, because you also can guess early on that the song about the woman who's been infected by the stone and the warp stone and the chaos mutation, it seems pretty obvious that that is going to turn out to be Katya.
Yes.
So there's you sort of dissipate a little bit of that tension when you find that out. But because that's not really what the story's about, the story's about Stefan and his relationship with chaos, his relationship with poor people and helping people and these other aspects. It didn't sort of end the story for me. There was still more interesting stuff to explore, I thought.
Yeah, I suppose those things are resolved, but on a very kind of top layer level, aren't they? So yes, he goes off and has a reformed career, maybe as working in the poorhouses. But who knows? He might have got bored of that after 6 months and gone back to making some money again. That's interesting, and it's something I talked about earlier, was about the way the mutated are treated. Is it an illness? Is it an affliction? Can you still offer them kindness? Does that mean they're evil, or are they just mutated? Is it no more than a deformity? So that comes up quite a lot, and again, that makes me think of lepers in the Dark Ages. People that were ill. How do you treat plague victims? Do you lock them off? So it feels very medieval in that sense. And I suppose you've got the healthcare for all question or not, haven't you, around the way that Katya was upset, the way that the injured man was treated to begin with. She wanted to keep him still and treat him there, and they wanted to move him, because if they treated him there and he didn't have the money to pay them, then they wouldn't have their money, or at least if they went to the temple and he found out they did have money, someone could be sent, so he could be sent back to their offices. And that was a very the politics of Middenheim at the time. And yeah, there's lots of avenues to talk about with those kind of things, and I think that definitely that sort of thing, that's where way I imagine the Warhammer world to be. It's not a place to be poor and meek.
Sure. I mean, yeah, you do get the sense that if you have an accident at work and you break your leg or something, that's
there's no injury lawyers for you.
Exactly.
No,
you're not going to be in a good spot. But yeah, I think you're right. It is quite a neat ending, right? Stefan does turn around and sort of just, not quite out of nowhere, but it is a very quick and complete turnaround to be, oh no, actually, I'm going to give up everything I thought I was going to do, and now I'm going to be a good guy at the end. Maybe that could have been explored a little bit more. Maybe if this was a fuller length novel or a story. It's interesting as well, because Nicola Griffith actually has continued to write and has since come back to these characters, Katya in particular, and has done a deal with Games Workshop, or been given permission by Games Workshop to continue writing and exploring the character, with a lot of the sort of Warhammer aspects removed from any further story.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I think that it is quite interesting, I think, as well, that as an author, she's still thinking about this character and still wants to explore this character and her story. And I'm not too surprised by that, because I think that there is a lot to explore here, and maybe the 20 pages of this story didn't really give enough space to get as deep as one might want. But I think that she does a fantastic job here of telling an interesting story, a very different story to the rest of the collection, and a very different story to most Warhammer fiction, I think, really.
I mean, Katya would be the character that I'd be interested in learning more about. You'd feel like they should have a more interesting life to move on to. As much as Stefan maybe evolves a little bit and grows as a character, he still feels like he's a bit wet behind the ears, and maybe his reaction still to her is that kind of unrequited love. He's had an event in his life that's changed him a bit, but I'm not too interested in finding out what he goes on. It's a bit of a backstory for him, maybe. But Katya, you could see her. She seemed a very confident, strong character, and she's very. It'd be nice to see how a character like that could develop based on that experience that she's had. So I can imagine her being lots of things. To be honest with you, you could quite easily weave her into many different story types. So, be interesting to see what she does with it.
Yeah. So this was. So the other was the first of two stories in this collection that was set in Middenheim. The next one in the collection is Apprentice Luck by Sean Flynn, and that's also set there. And this is a very different story, I think, to the other and to the previous stories, really. So this one tells the tale of Karl Spielbrunner, who is an apprentice bookseller who doesn't enjoy his life. So there's a common theme there, I think, across some of these protagonists. He wants to get out of the bookselling game, and that opportunity comes up when someone brings in a magical tome. His boss is out, so he buys this and he's basically going to sell it on for a lot of profit, he thinks. He finds in the spine of this book a little map, which he takes a look at and he memorizes, and then a creepy wizard, who may or may not be a necromancer who lives up the street, comes into the store and asks about the book. And Carl, because he wants to sell it and make the profit for himself, he says, I don't know anything about it. You'll have to come back and talk to the boss. That night, the wizard comes back and Carl escapes with the book out the back door because he doesn't want the wizard to take the book off of him, where he encounters a handsome young warrior who speaks in a really weird way and calls himself Argo. And in the space of one interaction, Carl agrees to go with Argo into the caverns beneath Middenheim using the map that he found in the magic book to evade all of the traps and to find some treasure that's not clear what treasure it is at the very heart of this dungeon, essentially. So they go off on this quest. They have to find their way into the caverns, which they go through a dodgy pub called the Drowned Rat, and then they get access to it and they go off on this quest. And it basically is a quest. They encounter marauding mobs of goblins and then some skeletons, and there's traps and all this sort of stuff. But as they get to the final room, Argo turns around and betrays Carl, and he's going to kill him because actually he's a bad guy, it turns out. But the wizard steps in and saves the day. And that's when we find out the treasure is actually the lost library of Fistora Sprats, a long-dead dwarf wizard, and that Carl is going to become the creepy wizard's new apprentice. So that is the story that we get here, a dungeon crawling quest. How did you find this one, Stu?
Least favorite so far, I think.
Right.
It was it's charming in its own way. It was a very simple, linear story. Again, very recognizable to an evening around a table with dice. Though because the story, I think, was a little less nuanced, it did feel a little bit less. If Geheimnis and Actors role play, this was more Hero Quest, isn't it, in terms of its depth of story? But I didn't hate it. It's not something I would sort of return to with vigor, but it does a nice job of telling a little story about a magic book, and it might give people inspiration for gaming nights and things like that, which I think a lot of these stories were. The characters were pretty vague. Suppose you didn't really spend. I mean, Argo's naturally vague because you're not supposed to know secrets about him, so it's very hard to develop that as a character anyway. The wizard, we don't know anything about him really because he kind of turns up 3 times, and that's he's supposed to be secretive. And then Carl, you know the most about, but he still does some, acts pretty bizarrely very quickly. Having this book, thinking I'm going to make some money out of it, to finding out what it is and still thinking, can I still try and make some money out of it? It seems that at that point you'd feel like, you have the book, I want to live, kind of thing. But he clearly hates his life that much. So that's a bit, I suppose, 80s movie almost esque of the unbelievable. No one in their right mind would do this, but then if we stopped it here, it wouldn't be a story. So we're going to do it anyway. So he's quite plucky in that sense, I suppose, isn't he? That he's almost finds the bravery of almost a child would have in an 80s movie. But I liked it. It was, in that sense, I liked it. It was easy. It was an easy read. There's a few bits that sort of took me out of the story. If not, I wasn't that deep in the story anyway. A few bits that took me out. They described, it was a bloody nose, as rich and as hot as fresh gravy. I mean, that seemed just. I've never heard blood described as fresh gravy. I know this was the era of Bisto adverts on the television all the time, so maybe the author was watching that. But it there's a couple of just little bits like that, but it's fun. I mean, the old Crone was called Scabby Elsa, it's amusing in that sense.
I liked this one.
Did you?
I did, and I surprised myself, and especially when you boil it down and sort of just in retrospect take a look at it. It's so simple and also pretty silly, because you're right. There's so many points at which you're just, why would Carl continue to be involved in any of this? Especially even early on, when he gets the book and his initial plan, right, I'm going to sell the book and make a load of money. Oh, wait, the book is actually bound in human flesh.
Skin.
And and instead of going, you know what, I'm going to get rid of this as quick as possible, it doesn't change his plan at all. He's like, oh, that might make it worth more, which is bizarre. What I thought, despite that, I think you're dead right when you say it is Hero Quest. This is just a dungeon crawl in its simplest sense. The book, I think, is an interesting setup, but that's not really, I don't think, what the author is interested in. They just want to get him into the dungeon to go on the quest. Now, perhaps that could have been a bit more elegantly done, but I think that the fact it is just a straight up quest and they've been flipping the cards, and okay, the first encounter is a load of goblins and the second encounter is a spike trap or pit trap or something. I quite enjoyed that because it just fired those little nostalgia neurons in my brain of like, yeah, I'm playing Hero Quest like by proxy. This is great. There were some cool details in there as well, I thought. So there was the actual the book itself having been found at the bottom of the Cliff of Sighs in Middenheim by the crone Scabielsa, because Argo, our ultimate villain, turns out to have pursued the original apprentice of the wizard who was trying to evade him and get away, and has got the book and basically decides to leap off of the cliff in order to protect the book and keep it away from Argo. I thought that was a very good sort of setup. And then to have the book find its way to Carl, that's quite nice. And then the other detail that I really, really like is Argo himself he's an undead creature, but he's not just a skeleton or a zombie. He's actually like Oogie Boogie from Nightmare Before Christmas. He's like a bundle of flies and creepy crawlies inside of Argo's skin, if you like.
Yes.
And he's still got
almost like something from the Mummy. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's creepy. There's a great visual by Martin McKenna of it, and it's just that is a good villain. I think he's probably telegraphed a bit too strongly. So when he talks throughout the course of the story, he refers to himself as us, and he has a buzzing voice, and his breath smells like crushed ants and things like this.
What's the crushed ant smell?
I don't know.
I remember reading that thinking,
So that's probably, it's not like the best laid out surprise, but when you get there, I think it's a cool idea. At least. Yeah.
I think I wonder if they'd added the backstory as almost like a prologue to it, with the rushing away from trying to get away from this impending foe and making that leap at the beginning. And you know that the book's left there at the bottom, and then it cuts to the crone bringing the book in. The jeopardy, the power behind that book may have seemed more in the first place, and wouldn't have made it quite as kind of, I don't know, it brought some impending doom there rather than trying to find it out drip bit by bit by bit. You might have been a little bit more suspicious of Argo, because when we first encountered Argo, I thought, yeah, this is probably a bad guy, but you never know. This could be an Aragorn kind of character, you know, behind his hood, and he could actually be there trying to help save him from the necromancer. And I think that's what you're trying to be led to believe, that maybe he's the good guy and the necromancer the bad guy. But I think if you you could have installed that jeopardy the other way around. If you were filming it, you would probably have a scene when the first apprentice was being pursued, petrified. Then he decides to either slips or he decides to take his own life, and that book's left. And then he cuts.
That's almost. I think that sparks an interesting thought, because in retrospect, I think that apprentice, rather than Carl, is probably in some ways a more interesting protagonist, because the sacrifice that apprentice commits to sacrifice themselves in order to save this book, because they truly believe in the wizard, they truly believe in protecting people and the magic and all that sort of stuff. That's a noble, interesting character. Carl's maybe yeah, he's certainly not, and because he's quite he wants to be something greater than himself. He dreams about being a captain of the watch. He obviously he goes on this quest precisely because he wants to be a hero on a quest, even though he doesn't really know what that means. So the title apprentice look, it works because he gets to be apprentice not because he deserves it, but because he's lucky that the other guy isn't around anymore who did deserve it. And he just goes on this weird thing. The other thought that just comes to mind is that this is classic fantasy wizard. There's a Gandalfian aspect to this wizard, or even a sort of Dumbledore of, if he was just straight up and just said what was going on and was like, listen, here's why it's dangerous. Here's what you can do to help me. And instead he acts in a real creepy way, and he's just like really superior, and he's kind of, I don't think he speaks in riddles, but you kind of get that feel about him. When he could just cut through all of that and just be like, listen, this is why I need your help. It's a shame.
Yeah, true. But it would have been a very short story.
It would have been a short story. Yeah, that's true. This book does have, so I like to keep a little track of the taverns and inns and hostelries that we see across these stories, because I think there's always some good names. I mean, I think in Gotrek and Felix, it's the Standing Stone Inn. We had the Red Moon in the other. In this one, there are two. There's the Drowned Rat, which is the sort of shady kind of gangster inn. And then there's also the Wolf's Grip, which is where Carl's boss likes to go and get drunk during the workday. And I just quite like that name, the Wolf's Grip. It's just, I don't know what it means really, but I like it. I think it's good.
That's quite a cool thing to do. Start collecting those.
It's basically so that I can rob them for when I run
the roleplay games.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like it.
Okay. So the next story, A Gardener in Paravon by Brian Craig. In this one, we are getting a tale recounted by Philip Labelle of his youth in the Bretonian city of Paravon. And he's talking about his young friend, Armand Carrière, who became obsessed with the contents of his neighbor's garden. So this garden had high hedges, couldn't quite see into it. It didn't get a lot of light, but he noticed that birds would constantly flock and fly into the garden and then wouldn't come back out, or at least not many of them would come back out. So Armand ends up climbing onto his own roof. He's trying to get a better angle. He's constantly reading about it and looking for some way into the garden. He gets seen doing this by the owner, by the neighbor, Gaspard Grier, who invites Philip and Armand over to see what's in the garden. When they go in, they find this odd sort of trellis that's been built that's got some really weirdly shaped, phallic-shaped plants on it that actually eat the birds. So their roots grab the birds and then they consume them. Philip and Armand take this quite well. Gaspard Grier, the neighbor, just lets them go on their way. But Armand has a really weird dream about a sort of chaotic kind of demon-looking creature that kind of flies and picks him up and takes him out the window, deposits him in the garden. He then wakes up, tells Philip about it. Philip's just not that interested, I guess. It's just a dream. Don't worry about it. But the next night, presumably the same thing has happened again, but this time Armand is found on the floor outside his window, having died from a fall, it seems like. Philip tells everybody about this dream that he'd been having, tells everybody about the neighbor and what they saw there and these weird plants that eat birds. And everybody just says, no, it's probably that Armand was a bit crazy. He liked to read weird stories, and maybe these dreams were just an indicator that he was going to throw himself out of a window. And that's kind of the end of the story. It's an odd one, I think, isn't it? What was your initial reaction to this?
It's odd. It's again, feels, the flow seems sort of, I don't know, trying to find the right words to describe it. It seems quite slow paced and steady, even with the more unusual parts of it. They don't really seem to, there's no kind of pick up in pace or jeopardy to the story. You almost feel like it's a tale that someone's reminiscing over, isn't it, rather than the others are stories within the time almost. But it feels like a filler, almost like a little kind of interlude before we move on to a longer story. Look at what chaos can be maybe within this world. It seems odd. But most part of it's okay. It's just there's some very strange parts in it. You know, so you alluded to the plants and the shape of the plants, the phallic symbol plants, and some of it's quite cool. I think it almost there's a birds are sort of trapped in the plants and almost being ingested, so it's almost like Alien meets the Day of the Triffids. It's kind of this really, it's a very strange reference, and not many people will get that, but it's very, that's odd, and I quite like that. And it's almost, you know, this chaos is clearly different in this story than it is in modern day fantasy. There are bits where I just don't know why they went there. The author went there. There's a scene, I suppose, where Gaspard Grullier is encouraging both Armand and Philippe to taste the juice from the end of these phallic plants. And Philippe does, and it's a sweet tasting. Armand does, and then Philippe doesn't. He says he doesn't feel comfortable tasting it. And it's kind of, you're reading this, you're thinking, yeah, you wouldn't put it in a book now, I suppose, aimed at this market.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you wouldn't put it in a book now. You wouldn't put it in a Warhammer book now. People are like, what are you doing? And it makes me wonder why that got through the edits there, because it's not that, those few lines are not needed. I'm not offended by it, and I'm not sure anyone would be, so I don't want anyone to misinterpret that. I found it jarring, because I found myself remembering that about the story, because it's such a short story. I remember that more than maybe some of the other parts that might be more interesting. It's just an odd thing to put there, unless you have a reason for it. But what is the reason for it? And you could go down a real cul-de-sac trying to guess what the reason was. And I'm not sure that's helpful, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And I think I agree, and maybe a hint of disagreement as well. But so I agree in the sense that it's quite a shocking moment, because there's nothing up to that point that would lead you to it. I don't think. Out of nowhere, we've just all of a sudden got, and also, amongst all of this other stuff that's happening, the plants are actually phallic as well. And we're also now going to, taste the sort of juices that are coming from them. And there's a weird sort of moment. I think this could potentially be the reason for it, is that you get the sense that this is almost the seduction of the youth, and Gaspard Grullier, this old man who's invited two young lads into his house, is then going to put these kids in danger, and in this case it's in danger of chaos, but not in an immediate physical way. And I think that's true of the whole story, because like you say, there isn't really a lot of tension to the story. There's a version of this, I think, that could have played out more like the Tom Hanks movie The Burbs, or Rear Window, or Disturbia, or any of those. My neighbor's doing something weird, I've clocked it, they've seen me seeing them do it, and now there's like a real, okay, is this gonna now, are they coming for me as a result of it? Whereas this story doesn't play out like that at all. It's so quiet and sort of calm in it. You do get a little bit of Armand kind of is like, okay, I'm a bit frustrated that I don't understand what's happening. But then when both boys do encounter, they go and see the garden, they're then just like, oh, okay. I guess we've seen it now.
It's a weird garden, but that's a bit weird.
A point before that where Armand, who's like climbed up on his own roof in order to take a look, because he's gone to some extreme lengths, but he basically is like, well, I think I'll just leave it now. Actually, I'll never know, and I'm happy never knowing, I guess. And then that's when Gaspard Grullier invites them in. So you kind of get this, there's a sort of unusual low stakes pace to the whole thing. But because it's chaos and because it's Warhammer, that's, I think, the insidiousness of it is that, it is a slow burn. There's just a guy who lives down the road who is feeding birds to his plants and potentially like doing something that's bringing these kind of demonic entities, these flying creatures into the world, or keeping them safe, or whatever his deal is. He's doing that. And not only does no one know, even if they do know, as they do at the end of the story, no one cares. And that's kind of, I think, the sort of insidiousness of it. And I think that potentially you could say, okay, well, that is made its most explicit in terms of
Yeah.
like the text, through that moment when Gaspard is like, "Oh, why don't you boys sample this thing?"
Yes. Yeah. I feel like that could have been done in a
Yeah, I mean, it
way
could have
that
been
made
done.
it feel more Warhammer, because it doesn't feel. It almost feels like it's almost saying it's so strange in the way it's presented. It's people are going to find allegory there, aren't they? They're going to this creepy old man. You've got all
Yeah,
these different things
yeah,
that you just wouldn't go anywhere near in a fantasy novel aimed at potentially a lot of teenagers and these
yeah.
days. And
That's
it
a
just
fair
feels,
point. Yeah,
it feels, as I said, it made me chuckle. I thought it was a strange story. It didn't feel very Warhammer, because I don't know, it feels like the interpretation of chaos, it isn't anything recognizable. So even that era, you've got your Realm of Chaos type books. So that it's not even that kind of chaos, is it? There's not one element there, I think, that it's recognizable. Even Bretonnia is not recognizable as the Bretonnia we see
sure.
in later editions as well. I know it was different in
Yeah,
in the earlier editions, but I didn't dislike it. It's not something I'm desperate to go back and read again either. I just thought it was, at the one so far, was the most strange.
Hmm.
It left me scratching my head of
Maybe not the most
why.
strange. I've got another candidate for
So
that.
far, so far.
Yeah, so far for sure. Yeah, no, I know what you mean, and I think, yeah, is it? Because actually, one of the contributions to Patreon chat, Ryan Speck was saying that the reason he disliked this story was because it doesn't really tell him anything about the Warhammer world at large. Like, do you really learn anything about chaos? Do you really learn anything about Bretonnia? Do you really learn anything about the Warhammer world? And I've been reflecting on that, and I think part of the issue is that Bretonnia itself is so different in later versions of Warhammer than it was early on in the sort of Warhammer story, when it was a bit more just a sort of a version of medieval France, and it was corrupt, and maybe there was a bit of decadence and a bit of like the chaos underneath, in the similar-ish way to the Empire, but just with a slightly different flavor. And obviously they then leaned into all the Arthurian legends and all that sort of stuff. So this version of Bretonnia being one where the most important things in a Bretonnian city are that your garden is really nice and that you don't have any debts. And that makes you a good neighbor, basically. And it doesn't matter if you're feeding demons at night or killing the neighborhood kids, as long as you don't have any debts. So I think that tells you a little bit about Bretonnia, but it's just a very different version of Bretonnia to what we'll see later. And they totally abandon, I think, that sort of conception of Bretonnia, really.
Yes, clearly. Yeah.
But yeah, an interesting story. Not my favorite, not my least favorite. I will be interested to see, because obviously this is written by Brian Craig, who's the pseudonym for Brian Stableford, but he would go on to write one of the trilogies of the GW books, the Orfeo trilogy. He also wrote one of the Dark Future books as well. So we'll be seeing a lot more of his writing as we go through. So I am interested in seeing where he goes next, because it's well written, this story.
Oh yes, it is. It's not kind of, that's the thing. It's got prose of it's quite nice. It's almost like I don't know. It's almost like they've serialized a long form poem into a little sort of strange story. That's maybe it's where some of his oddness comes from. But yeah, it's just a couple of little jarring parts. Probably the best way of describing it. But yeah.
It will be interesting to see what he does when he's got to tell us like a story with a more traditional structure. Like, I assume there will have to be through his Orfeo trilogy, because that's a continuing story progression. Although an interesting, and we'll get to it when we get to it, I suppose, but those stories are also stories being told to you by somebody about something else that's happening. So, because that's an aspect of this tale that I find interesting, because it doesn't really seem to do much. Like, there's no reason that you couldn't have set this story just in Paravon, and we are seeing the events happen to Armand in real time, as it were. But we're not. We're getting an older Philip telling us what happened, and I'm not sure why that is. I don't know why, because you don't get anything new from it by having it be a sort of tale that's already happened, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely makes sense. Absolutely. And maybe some of the elements to it would have felt more Warhammer if they were being told firsthand, so to speak. So
Yeah, more immediacy to it. And then you might also get more
yeah,
tension, I suppose, because we already
yeah,
know that Armand is something bad's going to happen to him because it already has, I
yeah,
suppose.
you get he's quite guessable quite early on.
Yeah. Right. We have arrived at The Starboat by Steve Baxter. Now, this is an interesting tale, I believe. So I'll quickly run through what I think this story was about, and then we can get into it. So a Slan by the name of Kotzer recruits a Norseman, Eric the Were, to rob a map from a Kislevites city, and to then join him on a journey deep into the Chaos Wastes to recover obsidian treasure from the heart of a crashed Slan spaceship. To accomplish this, they are going to use Kotzer's endless wealth and seemingly endless collection of mithril armor to build a tank that they call the Turtle, which has got all mod cons. And then they are going to ride in this completely enclosed tank with a team of warhorses inside it through the Chaos Wastes in order to get to this crashed spaceship and then steal the stuff from within it. They do this, but then when they get there, Kotzer touches something he shouldn't have. There's an explosion. He loses an arm, and then that begins to mutate. The Turtle is really knackered. Eric leads it back out of the Chaos Wastes, but it gets totally destroyed. All of the warhorses get corrupted by chaos, and Eric barely makes it out alive, having had to kill Kotzer and escape with just about his life and a memento from the crashed spaceship. So that's the broad overview of the story. But there seemed to be quite a lot in this one, I would say. So, Stu,
Yeah,
did you?
it's long, isn't it? It's long,
It
and
felt long, yeah.
I enjoyed it because I don't know where this crazy tale was going to go next. So I wanted to keep reading, and I was laughing quite a lot all the way through it. And when we talked before we started recording, I mentioned I just wrote some notes down and put a few expletives, and it's just bizarre. Some of the bullet points I made, and that won't be the way I describe it now as a whole, but some of the bullet points I made is so Coates was quite energetic and excitable at times, and I was just picturing Toad of Toad Hall, in the way he gets obsessed by a story. People who don't know Wind in the Willows, but he gets obsessed and he has to be controlled by people, and there's Eric and Ratty trying to control him, and then he gets a car. Well, if anyone knows Wind in the Willows, Toad causes trouble in a car, but I found it very hard to take him as a character seriously, and it was just such a bizarre way to tell the story. I think the core idea of exploring the old lore of the Slan involvement in the sort of formation of the Warhammer world as we know it, I like that. That interests me. I know they've kind of done away with most of that now and left it vague. I understand why, but I enjoyed that back then. I enjoyed that kind of crossover. So I'm not against any of that. But it seemed a weird way to tell the story. Why you need Coates to be an ex-human who was magically changed into a Slan by a wizard? Why can't he just be a Slan?
Yeah.
And why would this Bretonian peasant boy have enough knowledge to know enough about Slan to be able to act like a Slan? It's just weird, really, really weird.
Yeah. Because that was one of the details that I left out. The little overview there is that Coates of the Slan is actually revealed to be a human who has done a deal with a wizard to be turned into a Slan. And as part of that deal, seemingly has gotten access to loads of Slan gold, loads of mithril from somewhere, and also this knowledge of the deep Chaos Wastes and where you can find this crashed spaceship. And he as a Bretonian peasant boy who he was before he was converted into this magical Slan, he'd studied some of these texts. How on earth he got hold of those texts, I don't know. But yeah, so there's a few question marks around that, and I think you're right. Well, like, did you need that to happen, or did you just need an extra couple of pages of story? So you were just like, well, what if this is the twist, and we'll put something else in. And there's also earlier on something similar where Coates has turned up to recruit Eric the Were, and he says, "You are the Norseman who I need to complete this quest. I need you to come into the Chaos Wastes with me." He never has a specific reason why he needs Eric himself.
No,
but before we can go, you're going to have to go off on an adventure on your own to Kislev to steal the map for where we're going. So it's just this kind of odd, like, okay, well, I guess I'll go off on a quest on my own. And Eric does that. I actually really enjoyed that bit of the story.
It's good. It just doesn't make sense.
No, it's structurally totally unnecessary for the tale you're telling, which is supposed to be about Eric and Coates on a sort of buddy cop adventure into the Chaos Wastes. But before we can do that, we've got to have Eric have an adventure on his own. So it's kind of a weird choice, I think. But that adventure he does have in Kislev, I thought was a well-written bit of... It's like a heist, and he goes up against a giant in order to break into the palace, and it was fun.
It works. I mean, if you started with Illustria, with the slam and some what was around at that point? It was a limited Lisbon kind of... I can't remember which actual beasts and things were around. But if you started there and we need to do this, we are going to go and kidnap some Norse slaves, and then you befriend one of the slaves, and you can still have that good cop, bad cop kind of thing going on. You could have already had that map, maybe cut that little bit out, but they would have had a little adventure on the way if it was a longer story, so you could still get the fight with the giant in, but it would have still been a strange story. But I think it would have made a lot more sense. I did struggle a little bit with the tank. It just made me chuckle even more, because the story was already bizarre, and it was like, well, how are we going to get across the Chaos Ways safely? You think, well, fight bravely. No, we're going to build a little tank.
You say
it's not a little tank, is
it?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Got horses in it. It's like,
there seem to be two different teams of horses inside this tank that they've built. There's also like a sort of replica kind of swamp area for Kutza to hang out in. It seems like Eric has got a full like pure gym in there, because he's working out every day and night whilst he's on the journey. So there's a lot inside this little tank that they've covered in mithril in order to protect it. But then I'm really torn on this as a story, because I don't think I liked it overall, but there are some details in it that I really, really enjoyed. So the Kislev adventure I thought was a really fun little bit. The tank itself, I kind of find odd. I know there's lots of weird technology in the Warhammer world, so it's not the tanks existing so much as just why it needed to exist for this story, I guess. Yeah. But then Steve Baxter, the author, has gone to like real specific detail about some aspects of it, where he's like, okay, well, because Eric is actually quite a competent character, which I do like as well. When they first build the mithril protection, they put iron around each piece of mithril armor in order to seal it together. And then Eric just says, well, no, because now you've got the weak point being the iron. So he kicks out a piece of the mithril, it just comes straight out. And he says, that's not going to protect us. You need to do it as sort of interleaved bits of armor. That's quite a nice detail, because it shows us about Eric knowing what he's talking about and being quite competent. And it's also it means that Steve Baxter's kind of been thinking about, well, what would we need in order to achieve this? There's also because it's totally sealed, so they have a magic air ring that's just generating air, bringing air into it from outside so they can breathe. And then they also have a sort of a magic mirror so they can see where they're going, which are both nice details. But they don't have anything that accounts for like the leavings of the horses, which, two teams of war horses in there. Where is that stuff going? And so there's some details that are great, but by having explicitly talked about those practical details, you've then opened the door to all of the practical details you didn't cover, which is odd.
Yes, yeah, it is just strange. I just find it there's too many strange elements for me. But I enjoyed the ride. It made me chuckle in many places. And there are bits I quite like Eric as a character, actually, and I think a story about him would have gone a lot further. I mean, I'd much rather Eric was part of the Norse raiders from the Reavers, and you could have gone back to them, and maybe he was the survivor that got to go back, and so his character being explored more in that sense would have been more powerful in the book than maybe this just too many odd choices for me that weren't required.
I liked Eric. I didn't like Kotzer at all. And when he's revealed to be human, it's such an odd twist that it's almost meaningless, really. There was one other detail that I did really, really like a lot, and that's that the magic air ring that they use in order to bring air inside the turtle actually allows an air elemental from the Chaos Wastes to slowly infiltrate, and then it manifests, and then they have to have a fight inside the turtle. And I thought that was really cool. And Eric is really smart. He uses like the flames on their fire in order to smoke out the air elemental. Great scene, really, really cool, really nice idea, and a way of putting, again, kind of creating a sort of practical aspect of a magical thing, which is quite nice.
Yeah, that was quite a cool scene, and some of the fight scenes there, especially on their return from the starship, is quite good when they're kind of making that mad dash back out of the wastes, and you come across the Slaaneshi, and it's good. And the crazy horse thing at the end is
that was cool.
The mutations and things you mentioned in the Patreon chat about it being like the thing, and that was exactly what I thought about when I was reading it. I thought this is so there was some good elements in there, but it was the presentation of those ideas were haphazard, and it felt like there were quite a few stories. It's almost like you sat around a blackboard. It wouldn't have been a whiteboard at the time, maybe, but sat round and said, right, shoot some ideas. And everyone put their ideas for a story up. And he goes, you know what? I'm going to make one story from this. I'm going to use it all. It's kind of...
And we haven't even touched on the fact that it's a spaceship as well, that they're going to find a spaceship, which, as you said before, some of those sci-fi elements did exist in the Warhammer world. That's in there. It's in the earliest editions with the scenarios. Like Richard Halliwell was writing scenarios with Amazons with guns and all sorts. And
they mentioned a chainsaw attacking them at one point.
But it's
like, where did that come from?
Yes, that's my issue with it. I don't have a problem with those sort of sci-fi elements. That's fun. They can be integrated in a really interesting way. I suppose my issue here was just how pedestrian it felt, because there was no sense of wonder to it. Eric and Kotzer are both really chilled out and seem fully aware of all of the sci-fi stuff, and they just take it in their stride. So Eric mentions, I think that's a chainsaw, just like on the outside of the tank. And then when they find the spaceship, both of them are just like within a couple of lines are just like, well, I think it might not be a regular ship. Maybe it's a spaceship. Maybe they need oxygen because they're going between planets. And they're both just like, that makes sense, right? That sounds about right. They're just really chilled out on it. And that kind of saps a bit of the fun and a bit of the wonder for me, because they didn't seem to care about it, which is odd.
Yeah, they really shouldn't know what it is.
Yeah.
It's fun. I wrote at the end, wow, what a ride. And it was definitely a ride. And I've enjoyed exploring it and having, it's fun to have a conversation around it because it is so strange. But it wouldn't be I wouldn't be rushing out to say, guess what we're reading? My son's called Jacob. Jacob, what would you like tonight? I've got a story for you. I probably wouldn't pick it. It wouldn't really be the right thing, because he'd just be like, Dad, what's going on? And he'd be right.
Yeah.
But entertainment it was.
It was entertaining. It took a little bit long. I think Jim Ball in the Patreon chat summed it up in quite a succinct way, I think. He said, I was really excited about the promise of the story when it started, which I think is why I got so frustrated as it clunked along. And I agree with that. I think there's so much promise in there. It's a cool setup. There are some cool ideas throughout, but it just didn't feel like a sort of nicely progressing, interesting story. It felt like it just sort of dragged out a bit because it wasn't quite cohesive.
Yeah, that can make sense. I think that's a fair reflection.
Yeah. Right. We're going to get on to the title entry for this series, The Ignorant Armies by Jack Yeovil. This one is about a pair of warriors, Johann von Mecklenburg and his mentor Vukotic, who undertake a 10-year quest to try and find Johann's brother, Wolf, who has been abducted by a Chaos Lord and his warband. They attacked the Mecklenburg estate, they killed the family, they took Wolf away, and then they've just rampaged through the Empire, and now they've gone up through Kislev and out into the Chaos Wastes, and that is where our heroes have followed them. They arrive at a massive chaotic battlefield where every night warriors of chaos meet and fight one another just to prove who is the best chaos warrior, the Chaos Lord, who should inherit the sort of mantle of the chosen one or the ever chosen or whatever it might be. And in the heart of this strange battlefield where every night this fight takes place, there is an inn full of very strange characters who loot the bodies at night, during the day, sorry, and then at night they just cower and hide because the fighting's happening all around them. Johann and Vukotic managed to find the Chaos Lord who had abducted Wolf, and he tells them that actually Wolf has now taken over the warband, and Cicatrix, the villain, has now been sort of ousted and is about to die. And then Johann has to go and fight Wolf. They have a battle. Vukotic sacrifices himself and uses his blood in a Sigmarite act, sort of incantation. He uses his own blood to purify Wolf and to bring him back from his chaotic form, which is like a wolf man, back to a human, and the two brothers are then able to embrace and ultimately walk away. So there's a lot to this story. It's the longest story in the book. How did you feel about the Ignorant Armies?
I really, really like this one. I thought the first couple of pages felt quite modern in the style of writing. It could almost be a beginning to a modern day Black Library novel. They're quite dark. They're describing having to kill the horse to eat because the horse is sickly and they're hungry. They've run out of food. It's I quite liked it. I think I made a note right early doors saying this just reads or feels like a normal modern day Warhammer novel. As it progresses, the age of the novel, so to speak, comes to the fore more. So that's nothing to do with the style of the writing as such, more to do with the way that chaos is viewed and described, I think, which is slightly different to where it is now. And that's the only reason that changed. I really like the way it's written. I quite like the pacing of it. Works quite well. There is a feeling of jeopardy, and you don't really know where it's going to end, I suppose. And it's pretty dark all the way through. So I really, really enjoyed it. I really like the interactions between Johann and Vukotic. I really like the sort of that kind of his mentor, but now he respects him that he's a grown man. And clearly over the 10 years of this journey, they've both become even better warriors, excellent warriors. And they've seen some stuff over the years. And I really liked it. It's a simple story of a broken family, I suppose, with nothing, feels like he has nothing left to do other than go on the road and try to avenge his family's death and try and find his brother, even though it was maybe you'd imagine he thinks it's probably hopeless and he's not going to get to do it. I didn't expect the ending. I didn't expect for him to kind of be reunited with his rechanged brother. Though I think as a child, his brother he sort of changed back to the way he was by the time he was abducted, wasn't he? So back as a child, I think it mentioned. So I might be dreaming that part.
I don't remember that. It could be.
Maybe I misread it.
He still has the same wound. So Johann had wounded him with an arrow when they were younger, and he thinks that is the thing that caused Wolf to kind of become a bit distant and maybe set him on a pathway that would lead him to embracing chaos. So he has that open wound again, which I guess is to represent the fact that there's a second chance to not diverge from that one inflection point. But I don't remember It could be that he was young again. I don't recall that detail.
Might have misremembered it. Well, but it's, I didn't expect that to happen. I didn't expect there to be a happy end, or relatively happy end.
Sure.
There's a lot of death before that. It felt like he was just going to be either forced to kill his brother or was ultimately going to be killed by his brother. Because he's dark, but that was, there's a little bit of light at the end of that story, and apart from maybe say Gottschalk and Felix, where there's a little bit of levity, kind of, most of them are fairly dark towards the end. There's not much of that kind of a happy ending, so to speak. This feels like the first one where almost the goal was achieved, the ultimate goal was achieved, and maybe that's it being a longer story that was allowed more.
I suppose you do. So the other, I think, has got a relatively happy ending as well.
True.
I suppose the Apprentice look, you could argue. So maybe it's just the tone feels like they're sad endings more than the actual text. But I know what you mean. This one definitely was a very surprising happy ending. If it is indeed a happy ending, it's still a big
almost
sacrifice.
Too good to be true. You wouldn't. Yeah,
yes.
you are at the beginning. You're hoping, well, is his brother still captive? And as soon as you find out, or you work out, you realize that he's not captive. He's turned to chaos himself.
Yeah.
At no point did I think, you know what, he's going to be back to normal. I didn't see that coming. Whereas but a lot of the other stories are predictable.
Yeah, it's seeded nicely early on as well. I think you get some of the stuff around Wolf and how Wolf might not be, whilst Johann had sort of developed into a young man by the time that the chaos killed their family. He developed into a young man who was going to go on to become an elector count and was going to be the sort of, the noble one. And maybe Wolf had gone in a slightly different direction because of that incident where he got wounded. And then you also get an interaction, an encounter on their quest with some of the former workers at the estate.
Yes.
So I think it's the stable boy who's now been mutated into an enormous chaos warrior.
Yes,
and has no regrets about this. It's all is like fully embraced chaos, and they fight, and Johann has to fight and kill him. And that's kind of sets the tone for, okay, well, the people who were abducted, or the people who he knew from his childhood, Johann,
are probably not all right.
Exactly, yeah, exactly that. And I quite like there was also just a real sting in the tail of that when Johann has sort of tried to talk him down a little bit during the fight. He's trying to tell this sort of former stable boy, now chaos warrior, we used to be friends. We lived together at the estate, and why are you sort of doing this? And at the very end, just before he dies, the stable boy chaos warrior says, we were never friends. There's not some rosy history here. Essentially, he was a stable boy, he was a servant, and Johann was a lord. And so you even get the sort of class distinctions within that as well. That's quite interesting, I think. But yeah, I feel that actual encounter, that fight that they have with a couple of mutants, and there's a Skaven in there as well, which is cool. Nice to see the Rat Boys getting represented here in this set of stories finally. But that's a really cool fight scene, I think, as well. It's quite tense. It's quite dramatic. Yeah, really well written. And then I think to your point there as well around how this maybe starts off as a simpler story, and it starts off in a very modern way. Because like you say, there is that real grittiness of, we're going to have to kill the horse because we can't survive otherwise. That's a bleak opening to this story. And there's plenty of bleakness still to come. But there's also, by the time we get to that chaotic battlefield later on, and we're introduced to this collection of odd characters who live in the inn, that it kind of feels more, it's not comedic necessarily, but there's certainly an odd sort of lightness to those characters and the way they interact, and the sort of descriptions of them being a bit more playful, I think.
It's the strangest part of the story, their inclusion in many ways, because it's like, what's it doing there, and what are they really doing? We're told practically what they're doing there, but why? Okay, so it's a little strange, isn't it? I quite like the idea of the battlefield that they return to for the warriors to almost prove their worth, so that only the best of the best get to go on and fully ascend, maybe. But it is quite also a bit strange. They go back to the same place. So it's like the Chaos Waste Community 5-side of its pitch
I
or
like
something
that
like that.
though.
It's
Yeah,
like
I like
around the
'cause
back of the taverns, like the rough pub there with the concrete pitches around the back or something. But I don't dislike it at all. But it's the strangest part to me of the story, that it seems that you could have told the story without the encounter with the people in the tavern.
yeah.
They use as a narrative device to explain that is the battlefield, that people die there every day, and we strip the bodies, and the warriors will just come back every day. And it's I think that's why they're there, to help tell that. Someone's got to tell that part of the story. But
Yeah.
yeah,
I think that's a fair. Yeah, it's certainly an odd moment. I remember the first time I read it, and I was like, what is the explanation for these? Because there's no explanation for why the tavern is not destroyed during all of the battling and things like that. But I think that the idea that there is just this odd haven in the midst of all of this chaotic fighting, but obviously it itself is corrupted and sinister in a way. And I think we know, so Jack Yeovil is actually the pseudonym for Kim Newman, who is a film reviewer, has written loads of other novels as well since, a big horror fan. There's definitely that kind of horror movie aspect, I think, to this tavern and the people who are in it. There's almost there's like the Freaks kind of vibe to them, and there's just there's almost the Hills Have Eyes, maybe even. There's a collection of odd folk. I mean, one of them, the mayor, has a sword wound. He's got a sword right through his chest that he hasn't removed, because if he does, then he'll die.
Yes, yeah.
But then that's sort of so living with these kind of maladies and afflictions, and there's a lot of other issues that those characters have. There is a real oddness to the people who are there, but then that's also like they have to be odd in order to live where they live, which is amongst this sort of chaos fighting.
Maybe that's why they're left alone, because they're not of any significance, are they?
Probably. And I think that does work within the bounds of the story as well, because the chaos who are coming to fight on this battlefield, they are specifically there to fight one another to prove who is the best. So in this instance, and I know chaos love a good slaughter and a killing innocents and all that sort of stuff, the classic chaos day out, if you like. But in this case, they're only there to prove themselves, and that proves nothing by taking those guys out. Because there's a really, I quite like this, and I know it's not necessarily that chaos, certainly in a modern version, but there's a duel that Johan is having at the very end of the story. He's had to fight through the whole night protecting Wolf, who's sort of in a cocoon and is about to come back as his former self. So Johan has had to fight the other Chaos Lords in order to not get killed himself. And as the sun comes up, the chaos monstrosity that he's fighting just kind of salutes and is just like, "Are you going to be here tonight? Because we can continue fighting then if you want." And Johan's like, "No, I'm not. This is it for me." And the Chaos Lord guy is just disappointed about it. It's just like, fair enough, and just walks off. And there's kind of this weird honor aspect to it as well, which I quite liked.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. It's very strange. It is very strange. But I also quite like that within the Warhammer world, you can do a version of chaos that, because the machinations of chaos and their plans and what they want, the chaos gods, they've all got a little bit of Tzeentch in them. They all want weird stuff that we mere mortals can never truly understand. So them doing stuff like this, or having their followers do stuff like this, I quite like, because it's just, that doesn't make any sense. At least to me, it makes some kind of sense to the chaos gods, I guess.
Yes, yeah, I agree. Ultimately, they can, at this time especially, you can do anything you want with chaos. That was where the freedom of your imagination was really set free, wasn't it? And I think that's explored in the way they're in the different ways they're encountered in these stories.
Yeah, there's a few nice little bits of cinematic reference as well, and another thing mentioned in the Oldhammer fiction podcast. So Lewis mentions that The Searchers, the John Ford film with John Wayne in it, is a massive inspiration for this particular story. In that film, John Wayne has to go on a 5-year search to find his niece, who has been abducted by a war band who have attacked their homestead and then taken her away. And then when he does find her, the actual chief who had taken her is called Cicatriz, and the name of
Right.
the Chaos Lord in this story is Cicatrix,
Yeah.
or Cicatrice. So there's obviously like a name reference there. The fact that the Searchers has that similar kind of structure and that kind of time, because 10 years is a long time to be searching through the Empire and through the Chaos Wastes, I think.
Yes. Yes.
But I think that's fun. And again, the sort of Kim Newman drawing on filmic inspiration. There's also a poem that opens the story, a Matthew Arnold poem, Dover Beach, which is where the line about the ignorant armies clashing by night comes from. I don't really understand poetry very well, so I couldn't analyze the original poem myself, but I do like the line, and the ignorant armies is such a good term, especially for a group of chaos armies that are clashing for the sake of it. It's just it works so well. I'm sure there's a deeper meaning there, but yeah, it's very good.
I agree, definitely.
There is another fun bit of trivia is just that the characters Johan and Vukotic were created. They statted them up for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and put them into White Dwarf 118. Yes, there you go. Yeah, look at it. An amazing issue, that one. Fantastic.
It is. I didn't realize when I heard you mention it the other day, or someone, I can't remember who it was, but it might have been yourself on the thing. I thought, right, have I got that one? So I've got most from that era, and I did. And yes, it's a great issue without really sidetracking onto something else. There's a lot of good stuff in there.
Yeah, and there's actually going to be a few more. So across the initial GW books, several of the characters from these stories were actually put into White Dwarf for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay primarily, but for some other purposes as well, including characters in the next and final story. So this is The Laughter of the Dark Gods by William Bill King. He opened the anthology and he closes it as well. This is a completely different story to what we've just seen in Go Track and Felix. So in this one, we follow Kurt Von Deal, who has been ousted from his barony by his brothers, and he is leading a warband into the Chaos Wastes in search of the power that the Chaos Gods can give him in order to reclaim what he thinks is his birthright. And the story is essentially just the tale of someone going into the Chaos Wastes, not to come back out again without becoming chaos. This is not someone who wants to just survive. This is somebody who wants to become the chaos. So Kurt slowly starts to mutate over time. He's wearing the armor of a chaos warrior that he's defeated. He only has one member of his original party left, and that guy, Oleg, starts to turn into a beast man. He comes across a load of chaos dwarves, and they fall in as part of his warband because he's such a powerful warrior. And then slowly over time, he just accumulates a massive warband, joins a big war host, and lays siege, and becomes just part of this big chaos army. And ultimately, Kurt and the other lords of the Chaos Army get into an argument about which direction they're going to go in, and then fight and kill each other. And that's basically the story, just the descent into chaos for one particular character. What were your thoughts coming out of this story?
I'm a fan, probably because of that. I like the style of Bill King. I'm also familiar with the Von Deals because they're covered in the first sort of Gotrek and Felix omnibus.
Right.
So you see the other side of that story. You see the family that are basically living they're traveling, living in camps and things, looking for a new place to live because they've been banished. So you've still got nobility there, and you've got the servants, and you've got a lot of their village traveling. So it's another one. Definitely catch up on that first book soon, so you'll see the connections in a different way. It's really good. But I do like the kind of the slow change you see for Kurt throughout the time. He reflects a little bit at points. At some point he starts to realize that, is this crazy? You see him kind of almost battling with himself at times and thinking, this is one element. They talk about him thinking about home again, but then he can't really remember what home is anymore, can't really remember the faces of his families and things. So you see that slow change. And I thought Prince Dieter was quite an interesting character in it as well, because he almost becomes the voice in his ear, doesn't he? Twisting it a little bit. And he sort of there's a part where he basically says that the Chaos Gods are just doing this for their amusement, and Kurt's very angry. It's like, this is, you cannot blaspheme the Chaos Gods, and Prince Dieter is like, well, why? They all laugh and joke. They, that's what they do. That's what they expect. You are the one that's strange, not me for having this reactions. So you see that quite early on when they first meet, and that comes back more and more. And with the end, you see, it turns out that that's, all of that's probably true. At the end of the day, he's chaos. I suppose it shows that chaos is banned. Is bad. You are damned. You're on a route to nothing. You are there for the gods' amusement. You have been fooled. You think you're on a quest to power, to enlightenment, to freeing yourself from your family and from the world and the empire, and you're going on to better things. But you're not. You're just a tool and a plaything of the Chaos Gods, and they've seen you fight. And yes, you might be the greatest at the end, but ultimately, you will die, and you will, and you will just provide entertainment for them. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. There were a couple of very kind of Warhammer things for the time. The Slanessy champion, I made a note. So her name's Zella Silken Thighs or something like that. Did you pick up on that?
I didn't. But yeah, that's very
Zella Silken Thighs. Yeah, that's very of the era. Like, God. And then there was a champion he fights that's clearly references to the god Malal, which we don't see in modern day Warhammer anymore because of all the potential copyright issues, and it's not part of their world. So there are nice little touches like that in it, but it's ultimately a pretty straightforward, simple story of lots of blood and lust and fighting, of a Khornate warrior, but also that kind of a little bit of introspection and retrospection of his acts and his life, and actually, is it as good as he thought it was going to be? But ultimately, it's not. But I thought it was good fun and well written, and I liked it.
Yeah,
it's up there in my top 3 probably.
Yeah, same for me, absolutely. Because I think it was, like you say, there is more. Again, like Gotrek and Felix, really, there is more character to the story than I might have expected. If you hear this is going to be the story of a warrior marching into the Chaos Wastes who becomes a Chaos Lord, and slowly over time accrues a Chaos Warband, that might sound like it's going to be pretty boring, or at least there's not going to be a lot of nuance to this guy. If he wants to be a Chaos Lord, then that's going to be a pretty straightforward character arc. But I think that Bill King manages to find some really interesting stuff there. I mean, you get Oleg, his last remaining loyal warrior, who becomes just fully a beast man by the end of it. There's a point in time when he sort of looks back, and Kurt says, you can leave if you want. I'm not going to keep you. And he has to weigh up whether or not he thinks he will escape the Chaos Wastes, or if he should just stay and submit to whatever's going to happen to him. Obviously, he chooses to stay, but it's not really a choice, because he's going to lose either way. And that kind of is Kurt's deal as well. Once he's in, there's nothing else that can happen. And there's moments where he kind of regrets it, or moments where he thinks, like you say, this isn't quite what I thought I'd be getting out of it. But I quite like that there's not a stark kind of, this is not the monkey's paw kind of version of chaos where you wish for something and you get like a twisted evil version of it. I mean, it's a little bit like that, but it's not as just clean cut as that. Kurt wants power and he gets power, but over time, it's kind of a different version of that journey. He doesn't just get the power that he would want to go and retake or reclaim his homelands. He gets stronger, he gets more chaotic, he gets an army, but it's kind of, he doesn't really get to use it in any way he might want to. He's got all his power, but it's being controlled by these Chaos Gods to their ends. So there's kind of an interesting thing there. I quite like that as well.
It's handled very well. I think if it was written now, and I imagine there are stories written about Khornate warriors in AOS now,
Mm.
and I imagine they're a lot more straightforward. And whatever the fantasy version of Bolter Pawn is, that was what they would probably follow. And this, there is a lot more of that kind of discussion, as we both said, around the path and whether it's worth it. There's little elements all the way through. It's like Oleg mentions, your face has got a bit more few more lumps on it now. It's you're looking a bit different. Hope that's all right. It's almost like reminded me of The Fly.
Oh, yeah.
When he sort of things start to happen, like his ear falls off, and it's like, well, okay, it's probably worth it. It's kind of there's little elements to the changing of, they've got no control over it. They both recognize that he's probably not good, not healthy. There's another bit when he mentioned that when he saw Oleg again, and he was more hunched over, and it's just that there was definitely a lot of recognizing that the changes aren't good always.
But like what else are you going to do at this point? You either embrace it or you mentioned as well Prince Dieter the Unchanging. He's like a chaos lord who's wandering in the wastes, who kind of lost his way. He's sort of the voice of reason, if you can have reason in the chaos wastes. I thought he was a fantastic character, very funny, very interesting, a really unusual type of chaos warrior, because he's fully aware of everything that's happening here. And maybe that's why he's the Unchanging. Maybe that's why he doesn't get mutated physically, at least, because he's totally aware of the deals that are being made. He knows all about what the Chaos Wastes can do and will do, and what the gods want from everybody. But he's just accepted it as well. And he's really funny, a great character. I would love to see more of him. Sadly, I don't think we will, because he's one of the Chaos Lords who gets killed at the end. And even that he accepts. He doesn't even seem to have a dog in the fight about which direction to go in, but he just ends up as part of the Chaos Lords all got to kill each other ending.
But he could even be there at the behest of the Chaos Gods, there to twist and turn and change the mind of Kurt, or they're having fun. It's like Zinchian almost, isn't it? Having fun, almost telling him the truth. We're going to tell you what's happening to you, but you can't stop it now anyway. We're just playing. This is part of the game they're playing. To send this character there to tell him the truth, tell him what's going to happen, and Kurt doesn't believe it at the time, or chooses not to believe it and be obstinate, and eventually he turns out to be right. So it's a good character and a very good plot device in order to help sort of get you talk about those things, rather than it just coming from inside Kurt's and Oleg's thoughts and the way their actions are. Other people are putting doubts in their minds as well. So I like it. It's good.
Yeah, Tommy Tornston in the Patreon chat said that it's a strong description of the descent into madness from the inside, well written, and Chaos Dwarves, yay. And I completely agree. I really like that. It is a great just descent into chaos, what it's like to go on that journey, what it's like to build a warband as well. It's kind of this fun bit of lore around someone's army. And then the fact that
you could build this. It'd be fun to build as an army.
It's in the White Dwarf issue as well. Yeah, you get the army, and it's got the warband stats as well for like a load of different followers. Because absolutely, it's such a characterful army, because you do just have, well, here's a unit of Chaos Dwarves, but they're actually mutated Chaos Dwarves because they've been in the wastes for ages as well. Then you've got Beastmen over here. Then you've got a Chaos Warrior, Dieter the Unchanging, who's joined as well. There's so much character to this warband that, it's really fun. And I like this kind of story that kind of feels like this could have been Bill King's like Chaos Warband that he was using in Third Ed Warhammer at the time, for all we know. It feels like that. He thought he'd just tell the story of how his guys ended up on the table, and that's great. I really like it.
Yeah, that's probably why it works so well. And maybe why the most obviously Warhammer of their era, but obviously Warhammer stories are his, and he's the only one that's works in the studio, isn't he? He's the one writing the rules and things. All the others are external authors. So I think the person who's nailed the brief, if the brief was to be Warhammer, then these, for me anyway, are the most Warhammer novels.
I think that's fair. I do love this one as a counterpoint to the Ignorant Armies as well, because you've got a couple of heroes wandering into this battlefield and finding out, okay, Chaos just fights itself as well as everybody else in order to prove who's the best. And then you see how the Chaos guys end up on that battlefield as well, more or less.
Yes. Yeah.
And I quite like that juxtaposition of those two stories, especially, putting them together. How did you feel about this as the sort of closing out the collection?
I think it works for the reasons you've mentioned there. Really, it's it just sort of, those two dovetail, those last two. I think the strength of the story, but it's also quite straightforward, so it's not hard to get your head around. It's strong start and finish to the book, and I think that's important in any book, really. But I think it. I don't know. I think you can pick the book up and you really enjoy that first story, and then you leave the book thinking, well, the last two stories are really good and strong, and a different order. You may leave you scratching your head a little bit more if the Starbow was at the end.
Yeah.
So I think the choice of the order was very good. So and I think that's probably deliberate. It's almost like choosing a set list on a music album, and I think I think they've done it right here. I wouldn't really change the order of any of the stories. And yeah, my favorite three are probably the first and the last two. And the others I didn't dislike, but those stronger three create a stronger lasting impression. So one at the beginning and two really good ones at the end, and it's been good fun. I like the book as a whole, but more so probably because of that.
I agree. I think the hit rate for me was really high. Even so, my least favorite story in the collection probably is the Starboat, but even that I still enjoyed. I still got something out of. I still enjoyed certain aspects of it. I really liked the other as well. I think that for me is quite high up because there is just something else to that story. I had a hard time trying to decide, okay, Laughter of the Dark Gods, the other, Ignorant Armies, maybe even Geheimnisnacht. Maybe there's 4 top stories for me out of 8. And
yeah,
even the stories that weren't sort of technically as strong, I guess, like Apprentice Luck, was still, for me, great fun. I enjoyed reading it and sort of being part of that story. So yeah, I think that this was a very strong first collection for GW books. I think they did a great job. I mean, the theme that sort of ties it all together, I think, being that the chaos and the sort of mutation and those kinds of fears. Obviously there's a lot of real world aspects to that, and whether that might be the chaos wastes being relevant to sort of anxieties about nuclear fallout, and you could argue that there's certain aspects of capitalist mindsets in the characters who are in the tavern in Ignorant Armies, and they sort of go out and loot the bodies and sort of do this day after day after day, making themselves wealthy without changing anything or getting anything out of it. So there's a lot of that throughout a lot of the stories, which for me makes them feel like there's a little bit more than just the surface level fantasy adventures.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a bit of depth, a bit of subtext, and some very interesting ideas pretty much across all of them, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it being a book of its time is definitely something there, and you could explore that as a fairly deep conversation in itself if you wanted to. You see that within 40k at the time as well. There's lots of sort of political pastiches. There's lots of that, and it's fun. And if you look at it on that level, it is fun. So I quite enjoy that, and I quite enjoyed looking at those connections with some of the comments. We talk about the healthcare side of things. There's lots of little elements, and I like that. I think that's good, and it's definitely like that kind of post-apocalyptic, potentially post-apocalyptic, the mutant-y stuff, the idea of the political tensions at the time in terms of a global political tensions is interesting as well. So I like that. I like the way they sort of shape those stories, and everything's of its time, isn't it? That's part of what made Warhammer at that time what it was. So it's good to explore that. That's probably the most interesting thing for me here was 3 or 4 of these stories I just genuinely really, really like as stories, but I've really enjoyed exploring them all as part of that expansion of Oldhammer. And my interest in nostalgia and Oldhammer, and looking at them and in a different way. Whereas if I just picked up the book in isolation, I might have almost skimmed through a couple of the stories thinking, well, that's a bit strange. Okay, I'm not really giving it any thought, but at least in this context, it's been a very interesting way of approaching them and looking at them in a little bit more detail than you usually might do for a short story of 19 pages or so.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same. Yeah, I think it's been very interesting to have that lens to look at them through, knowing we were going to talk about them, knowing we were going to explore them, and also knowing that there's a lot of interesting history around them, you know, the way in which Warhammer was developing, and how much these kinds of stories, although some of them have been forgotten and some of them might have been morphed and changed, there is a long tail to what was written here that has influenced a lot of subsequent Warhammer development. So bringing that into it and kind of with that context, looking at these stories has been really interesting. And I think will be interesting for the next 16 months. If we make it, I think we will. Through all of the GW books, we've got Drachenfels coming up next. So that is Jack Yeovil's first full-length novel in the Warhammer world. It is about a vampire and, well, the Great Enchanter, as he's called, a very powerful undead entity, and the heroes who have dispatched him and the play that they're going to be putting on. So that will be coming in September. We're going to be reading through that, and we're going to get together again, both on the Patreon towards the end of September, and that's an opportunity for all of my patrons to come and share some time talking with me live in a stream, where we'll actually go through all of that good stuff and talk about what we thought the story was, what the themes were, what our favorite characters were, and all the trivia and stuff like that. And then Stu and I will be getting back together to do another conversation like this, where we talk about all of that good stuff again and bring it to life for everybody who just wants to follow along on the channel. Stu, where can people find you in the meantime?
Well, Miniature Realms, pretty much anywhere. So there's a YouTube channel in terms of stuff like this, but I'm a commission painter by day job. So you'll find me on sort of Facebook and Instagram and X, it's called now, not Twitter, isn't it? And Threads and all this. So if you search Miniature Realms anyway, you'll probably find it. And my channel is a real mix. There's lots of Warhammer type stuff. I do cover historical stuff as well. And because I paint for a day job, there's lots of painting tutorials and things.
Fantastic. Great stuff. Yeah, and you just did a Chaos Warrior, in fact, I think, didn't you, as well?
I have, yeah. That was my, at the time of recording this, was my last Warhammer, the old world related or fantasy related tutorial. Yeah. So I'm having
any chance that that is Prince Dieter the Unchanging?
Well, it could be. It could be.
He's now my favorite Chaos Warrior of all.
He's yeah, I didn't picture him like that. I don't know why. I think might be fun to explore that as a miniature thing. This might give me some other ideas.
Great stuff.
I've got time for them.
Well, thank you very much, Stu, for joining me in this. Thank you, everybody else, for joining us to listen to us talk about the Ignorant Armies, the collection of stories, the first book by GW Books. Please, in the comments, let us know what you thought about the stories. What were your favorites? What were your favorite scenes? What do you think worked and didn't work? What are you looking forward to in the next book, Drachenfels? So until then, thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan. This is Stu. And this is Jordan Sorcery's GW Books Club.